For our scripture today, we'll be reading from the book of Mark, chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. And again, that will be Mark, chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. And I will be reading from the New Living Translation. So here is Mark 10, 32 through 45. They were now on the way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. "Listen," he said, "we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him, but after 3 days he will rise again." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do us a favor." "What is your request?" Jesus asked. They replied, "When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must be baptized with?" "Oh, yes," they replied, "we are able." Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. So Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must first be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I can't tell you how many times my mom asked me to do something when I want to say little, but I know that it probably went up into my teenage years. And Mom, if you end up watching the YouTube video of this or hear this, I'm sorry that I was that way when I was younger. But I think everybody is to some degree. And it would be things like, "Did you get your homework done?" "I'll get it done." "Did you get your homework done?" "I'll get it done." The next morning, "Did you get your homework done?" "Ooh," and I hadn't done my homework. And so then I would be in my seat in math class as like in the 5 minutes before class started, furiously trying to get math problems done. Or there were any number of things that could apply to. When we open up the book of Mark today and read this passage, this is not the first time that Jesus has told his disciples that he is going to Jerusalem, that he is going to be put on trial, he is going to be found guilty on false charges, he is going to be beaten, made to suffer, and killed, but will rise again. So this is not the second time that Jesus has told his disciples that they're going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer, he's going to get killed, he's going to rise again. This is the third time in the book of Mark that Jesus has told his disciples, "Look, we're going to go to Jerusalem. I am going to suffer, I am going to get killed, but I am going to rise again." And the disciples in any of the Gospels are constantly going through this pattern where they hear something, but it doesn't quite sink in. And at best, Jesus has to say it 2 or 3 times before they get it. But there are so many places where it will say they understood this after he had risen from the dead. And what we read today clearly is another misunderstanding by the disciples. Because here James and John are. And James and John are the sons of Zebedee. Their father's name was Zebedee, which is not a name you hear much anymore. They were also known as the Boanerges, the sons of thunder, and they had a reputation. And so as they're hearing Jesus say this, they're going to Jerusalem. We're a pretty decent way into Mark by this point, and they have seen healings, they have seen demons cast out, they have seen Jesus calm storms. They were on the Mount of Transfiguration when they with Peter were able to see Jesus transformed from his earthly likeness into his divine glory, with Moses on one side and Elijah on the other, and the voice of God in the midst of a cloud. And it's this great scene that was a callback to Israel's history. They were there for that, and they know that Jesus is the Messiah, but they're thinking of Jesus in the wrong way. They're putting him in the wrong category. Because Jesus's Messiah was not the first Messiah to come along. He was not even the only Messiah who was around, the suspected Messiah around at that point. And in fact, there were some groups that when one person who was thought to be the Messiah would be killed for, trying to do something messianic that he was not obviously capable of, if he had a son or a brother, then the mantle would pass on and it would go that way. And so it would go. But Jesus is different. And there's been a lot of things that James and John have seen that have them convinced. And now he's going to Jerusalem. And it's a really loaded scene, because for Jesus to go to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is where the temple is. Jerusalem is the holy city, the city where David brought the Ark of the Covenant, the city where Solomon built the temple. It's the temple, or it's the city of prophecy and expectation for God's people at this point in the book of Mark. And they were thinking that Jesus is going to finally sort out this situation between the Israelites and the Romans, and to throw off the oppression, to purify the temple, to establish justice and inaugurate an age of God's righteousness, where Israel would become the greatest among the nations. But James and John have a different perspective on how Jesus is going to do this. What James and John think is that Jesus is going to do this by force, or that maybe he'll go there and he'll do something and will be just crowned king. And I don't know what they think he was getting on about with all of the suffering language, because he makes it very clear what's going to happen to him. And in this passage, he's very specific. He says he's going to get flogged. They're going to beat him with a whip. They're going to mock him and spit on him. And all of this happens to Jesus. And then they still ask to sit on either side of him when he sits upon his glorious throne. And when they think of him sitting on his glorious throne, they're thinking that this is going to be the throne over which he will, rule over the whole earth. And sometimes before a big game, the captain of the soccer team, or the star quarterback, or the hot shot basketball player will give an interview, and they'll say, if they're really confident going into their game or their match, they'll say, how do you feel going into this? And they'll go, well, it's going to be a big struggle, but after 90 minutes, I think we can come out on top. And I guess maybe they think Jesus is kind of giving a pregame pep talk, like, it's going to be hard, but by the time, the dust settles and we give 110% and we really put it all on the line, all of those cheesy sports metaphors that people roll out in these interviews when they don't know what else to say. Maybe they think Jesus is going through that. But Jesus means something very different. And he turns their question around on them, and he asks them if they are able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that he's about to drink from, and are they able to be baptized with the baptism that he'll go through. Now, the cup has been used, the image of this bitter cup has been used by Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, a couple of the minor prophets, as a way of talking about God's judgment on the sinfulness of the world. That this is the cup of God's judgment. And Jesus is saying that he is going to drink this cup of God's judgment. Baptism, we know from, being Baptists, and I hope you know from being Baptists, and from earlier passages in Mark, that baptism is done as a symbol of dying to an old way of life that reveled in the ways of the world, that we are put under the water as a symbolism that we are dying to our sinful ways. We are dying to the ways of the world, and we are rising into the resurrection and the resurrected ways of Christ. And so he says he's going to undergo this baptism of suffering. And he says, can you go through this? They think they can, but it shows their arrogance. The problem that we're dealing with here is James and John are thinking I said that they had put him in the wrong column, put Jesus in the wrong column. They're thinking of Jesus in the earthly ways of power. They're thinking that Jesus's victory is going to come by the ways that all of the victories of the world happen. And you ask yourself, well, how do victories in the world happen? Somebody overpowers somebody else. Pure and simple. Whoever has the most might, whoever has the most bullets, whoever has the biggest knife, whoever has the most money, usually wins. That's the way of the world. Power enforced through violence. That's how things are decided in the way of the world. And that's how James and John seem to think this is going to go. And Jesus says, yes, you'll go through this, but it's not up to you and it's not up to me as to who's going to end up on my right and my left at the end. What Jesus knows that James and John don't yet know, but Jesus is about to remind everybody, is that power in God's kingdom comes through sacrifice. It comes through service. And Jesus gets right down to the point and says, and I'm going to read this again, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. And this is the pattern that we see in the world all the time. We live in a world where the rich and the powerful get their way, and those who are not rich and powerful have to live in the wake of what the rich and powerful decide to do. And when confronted with challenges to their power, the rich and powerful do what they have to stay in power. They come up with stories, they come up with narratives, they call things fraudulent that are not fraudulent. They spend loads and loads of money trying to maintain their wealth and authority and their image. And they lie and they won't back down. This is the way of power in our world. And they bully people and they push people around. And if you've ever had a bad boss, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever had, if you are working for somebody and they are a bully, if that's all they've ever known is how to push people around, then you will know what this worldly power looks like on a much smaller scale. Because they push you around, they order you around, and if you don't go along with their way, then and you don't do it exactly the way they want to, then you get made fun of, or they find a way to punish you, or something like that. This is the way of power in the world. But then Jesus says, it will not be so with you. Jesus says, if we are going to be his people, power looks different for us than it does for the rest of the world. Because the truth of it, friends, is this. When Jesus goes to the cross, that is when he's sitting on his glorious throne. Power in God's kingdom looks like Jesus on the cross. And when Jesus is on the cross, there is somebody to his right and there is somebody to his left. And they are suffering as well. And when Jesus is on the cross, it is a humiliating defeat in the eyes of the world. No one standing there that day, watching Jesus crucified, hanging naked from a cross, in complete humiliation, not just as a Jew, but as a human being, and especially in the eyes of the Romans, it was legitimately the most humiliating death anybody could die at that time. But yet, this is the source of Jesus's power. Jesus's victory over sin and death comes on the cross. This is the story of power in God's kingdom. And Jesus goes on to say it himself, is whoever wants to be the greatest among you must be a servant. And Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 that Jesus was a servant to death, even death on a cross. When we as followers of Jesus want to examine what power looks like in the world, we have to look at the cross. If the power that's being offered us as followers of Jesus isn't power in the shape of a cross, we shouldn't be interested. We shouldn't be interested as God's people, as the church, when we are offered power by people who deal in worldly power, because it's not in the shape of the cross. It's always going to, if we make this bargain and we let somebody, say, in a position of worldly power, say that they're going to give their influence to the church, we need to be very skeptical. We need to be very hesitant, because gaining that power will require us to step on the very people that Jesus says that we ought to love and care for. If we want to be seen as powerful in the world, then instead of stepping on those people, we as God's people, the church, need to be loving and caring for and serving those people. The ones that Jesus describes in Matthew 25 as the least of these, my brothers and sisters. Because it is through serving in the shape of the cross, in sacrificial ways, in ways that will cost us our worldly influence, in associating with people that are not popular and are not powerful, that is when we are doing exactly what Jesus wants us to do. That's when we are following the ways of Jesus the closest. Individually, though, you may be sitting there thinking, well, who am I? I don't have any power. Who am I? I don't, no one listens to me. I don't have any influence. I'm not great or important. And I would say that's not true. There's somebody who listens to you, and there's somebody who pays attention to you. There's somebody to whom your opinion matters. And if we are being formed and shaped as followers in Jesus by the ways of the world, then our thoughts, our opinions, the way we live our lives, who we care for, who we pay attention to, and who we cast off to the side are going to look very different than if we are gaining our power as people who are serving and loving sacrificially in the world. And there are all sorts of voices we can listen to and all sorts of sources of information that we can be considering. But when we are making our way through the world individually, we need to live our lives with the power of the cross, not the power of the world. The power of the cross acknowledges that every human being on planet Earth and the ones on the International Space Station, they all matter. That every human life is important to God. And that our task of loving and serving people is not going to make us great in the eyes of the world. No one is going to exalt us for living humble, sacrificial lives day to day. You are not going to become a social media influencer, as they call people who have lots and lots of followers on social media channels. You're not going to become an influencer by living the way of the cross, but you are going to be faithful to Jesus. And the people that Jesus served are going to see you as great in their eyes, not because of who you are, but because of who Jesus is. When the power of the world extends its power to us, it is always a deal that will end up the exact opposite of the cross. The world's power will always crush someone. The world's power will always oppress someone. The world's power will always make sure that someone stays in a position of high power and wealth and authority, and that somebody else is subservient. But if we are living our lives in the shape of the cross, we are loving people, we are serving people, we are seeing what is broken in the world, and we are bringing the healing of Christ and the presence of Christ into those situations and setting people free, because that's what Jesus did on the cross. Now, how do we go about doing this? I think the first thing that we have to look at is, what are the voices that are influencing us, that are forming us? Because we're all kind of like clay pots. And if you've ever seen somebody work a piece of clay on a pottery wheel, they can work it in different ways and make different shapes out of it. Or if you are very untrained, well, you just make a whole lot of ashtrays. But I don't even know if people use ashtrays anymore, but that's beside the point. We can be formed by the ways of the world into something that looks like the world, where power is enforced through violence and money, where somebody's constantly squished while somebody else rises to the top. Or we can be formed in the ways of the cross. And sometimes the ways of the world put on the clothing of Christ. And sometimes It can be confusing. But let me say this again. If it isn't power in the shape of the cross, we shouldn't be interested. And after that, as long as we're letting the voices that influence us and form us and shape us be the ones that are themselves in the shape of the cross, in love expressed through sacrifice, or as biblical scholar William Lane writes, the order of life for the common dealings of the disciple is to be love expressed in the form of service. We get about that. We get about doing that. Because when we're seeing the world through the eyes of the cross, and we're formed and shaped by the power of the cross, then we will start to see those people that we can love and serve. And we love and serve each other in the church, and we love and serve people who are in our communities and in our neighborhoods. The cross is going to come into a much bigger focus from here on out. Because in the book of Mark, it's right after last week. Last week we read from chapter 8, and this week we're in chapter 10. And somewhere around this time, the focus starts to turn from just Jesus's teachings and miracles and everything like that to what love expressed through self-sacrifice looks like. And friends, let me say this. When we live in the ways of the cross, when we live in the ways of Jesus, we truly live. We truly live the lives that God meant for us to live. And it won't always be easy. But when we are following the ways of the cross, we are always going with Jesus, who has gone before us and who comes with us alongside us and has our backs as well. Because this is the way of the cross.